interview for the Eat Street Oral History Project. It is Tuesday, March 7th, 2017, and I'm here at the Whittier Alliance with Joanne Christ from the Black Forest Inn. My name is Kim Hakela. I own and operate Spotlight Oral History, and today I'll be interviewing Joanne about the long history of the Black Forest Inn, as well as her role in helping to shape Nicollet Avenue into Eat Street. So Joanne, before we get into the meat of the interview, I'm just going to start with by getting some very basic biographical information from you, just so we have it on the record. So can you please spell your name for us?
All right, my first name is Joanne, Joanne. My last name is Christ, Chrisst.
And you opened well, I guess your husband actually opened the restaurant before you were part of it.
Right.
And how do you spell and pronounce his name?
His name is Erich Christ, and his first name is spelled Erich, and his last name is spelled Christ.
Okay. And can you tell us the current business address of the Black Forest Inn?
Its mailing address is 1 East 26th Street, Minneapolis 55404, and that's at the corner of 26th Street and Nicollet Avenue.
Okay. And has it been at that location for the duration of its existence?
Yes.
And what year did Erich open the Black Forest Inn?
1965.
Okay. And do you and Erich now own or operate any other businesses?
No.
Okay. But you did in the past?
Yes.
Okay, and tell us just really briefly what those other businesses were.
We had operated a deli in the building next door to the Black Forest Inn called Strudel and Noodle for maybe 8 years, I'm not exactly sure, 8 to 10 years. And we also opened a second Austrian-German restaurant in River Place on the Mississippi River in 1984, I believe, called Restaurant Lorelei, which really only lasted a year and a half or so. The expectations were just not fulfilled, and we got out of that one.
The Black Forest Inn now has been around for a long time, more than 50 years.
A long time, yeah.
And how do you, and I'll ask this of Erich as well, but how do you identify yourself racially or ethnically? What is your background?
I'm of European heritage. My father was born in Germany, in the Bavarian part of Germany, and my mother was Polish. From somewhere, perhaps it's nationally, I think it was actually Austro-Hungary at the time, but ethnically she was Polish. And Erich was born in Germany.
And what part of Germany was he born in?
He was born in Mannheim, which is south and west in Germany, but on the same parallel as Paris, really, straight east from Paris.
And so I want to start just getting a little bit of a personal background on you and your family and how you came to meet Erich and get into this business. So tell me, where were you born and in what year, if you're willing?
I was born in Minneapolis in 1945.
Okay. All right. And how many siblings do you have? Do you have siblings?
I have one remaining sibling, my brother, an older brother.
Okay. And what did your parents do?
My father ran a branch of Norden Laboratories, which sold veterinary supplies locally to animal hospitals and to veterinarians through the Midwest, mostly through Minnesota and some parts of Wisconsin. And so he had a small office that he ran under the direction of a veterinarian who kind of drove around and made all of the calls.
And your mom?
She didn't work outside.
Outside.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And so, given your parents' background, what language or languages did you speak at home?
Just English.
So it was English.
Yeah.
They obviously spoke other
English.
languages as well, but
They did.
at home they emphasized English.
Right.
For you? Okay. When did your father and mother, for that matter, when did they come to the U.S.?
Well, my father came in the 20s, 1920s. He was the younger son in a farming family, so the farm goes to the eldest son, and the younger sons kind of fend for themselves, and to some extent that probably is still the case, although farming is a smaller part of the economy now, was a huge part then. And he just decided that his chances of bettering himself or whatever, or finding a life to his satisfaction would be better here. So he was the only child from his family to emigrate. My mother came over as a young person, I think maybe about at age 7, with her mother and 3 other siblings. And then her father had already been in the United States working, I believe in Chicago, and a couple of more children were born to that family, and the family lived between Chicago and Minneapolis, some here, some there, and a little bit of back and forth.
So both your parents were here in the U.S. during World War II?
Right,
Okay.
right.
And I would imagine, well, let me ask, do you remember even yourself as a child either experiencing or hearing from your parents about any kind of anti-German sentiment during the war years or thereafter?
I don't remember specifics of any sort. I think I sensed a little bit of a reluctance in my father to really acknowledge and talk about his German heritage, and perhaps also a little maybe standoffishness or whatever from other people if they heard his accent, which he did have. So whatever ideas I had about that, they were kind of vague and ever so slightly mysterious. I mean, I was born in 45, so the war was over, and by the time I would even be thinking about something like that, age 10 or 12 or so, by then it's kind of a foggy memory, even for the people who I might have sensed some of that remaining anxieties about war and who was what and so forth. But it wasn't spoken of particularly.
But your father did not emphasize or help you learn to speak German?
No, he didn't. He didn't.
So tell me, and I may know the answers to some of these questions already because we have talked before, but I just want to make sure we get them on the record here. Tell me how it is that Erich came to the United States and when he came.
Well, Erich is the 4th son in a family of 6, and his eldest daughter worked for the Americans in Mannheim as a teenager, as an older teenager, and really helped to support the family that way. And she and a young man at that time developed an interest in her and kind of held on to that despite being sent back home, and really urged her to come over and to marry him, which she eventually did. So his eldest sister ended up in Texas with an American. The next one down the line, my husband Erich's brother, 2 steps up from him in the family, befriended an officer in the same basic American Army base in Mannheim, who said he would be happy to sponsor him if he would like to come over, which he did. And he became a salesman. He was a stained glass maker by trade. He did that for a while and then became a salesman, and so he traveled around the U.S. somewhat. And the person who sponsored him was from, I think, North Dakota, possibly South Dakota, but one of the Dakotas. And so he did kind of gradually work his way toward the Midwest just to maybe touch base with this person, although he didn't. He wasn't economically or financially backing Gerhardt. He simply supported his emigration. And then because of the two older siblings, Erish's sister, one step up, came over and lived in Texas for a while and ended up in Boston, where she still is. And Erich just decided that would be a great thing to do. So he really, on a wish and a prayer, he just got on the boat and went over. Of course, he had siblings here, so he had some place to go and support. But he started also in Boston, went to Milwaukee, where at this point his brother was, and in Milwaukee worked as a cook. Erich had two trades when he was in Germany. The first one was as a butcher, which he completed and worked for a while and decided he wasn't totally satisfied with that, and decided that he would add cooking to his repertoire, so he became an apprentice and worked in some places in Germany before he left. And so he ended up in Milwaukee with his brother, living with his brother, working at a few different places in Milwaukee, and he was drafted into the American Army then. Erich was, yeah. And served his time in the early 60s, and once was enough for him, and he saved all of his money, which probably ended up to be a couple of $1,000s, which was all that was needed to put a down payment on the Black Forest. Meanwhile, his brother, while Erich was in the Army, his brother was traveling around and saw this place, this Black Forest Inn, and kind of was ready for Erich when he was out of the Army, and they both put, I think, $1,000 down and started the business in 1965.
And this was his brother Gerhardt?
Correct, yeah.
Now, did Gerhardt have any background in cooking and restaurants,
No.
operations, anything?
No.
So he was just looking for a business?
Right,
opportunity.
yes. I think he saw himself more as in the front of the house.
And was it called the Black Forest Inn at that time?
It had been for a little while, and as I piece it back together, the people who owned it just before Erich and Gerhardt bought it were the equivalent, the 1960s equivalent of flippers. I think they would buy or somehow attain an interest in places that were transitioning for whatever reasons, as businesses do, and then look for, I think they were good at putting out feelers for finding people who might be interested and be capable. That particular location had been the home to maybe 10 different places in 7 years. I mean, there was something that caused it to be very transitional for a long time.
So that would have been late 50s, early 60s,
Yes.
where there was this kind of rapid turnover of
Yes.
businesses coming into that
Right, right.
So let's go to you and Erich then. So we know a little bit about how Erich and his brother Gerhardt started the business. Did Gerhardt stay involved in it?
Until 1970. We bought Gerhardt out in 1970.
Okay. And how did you get involved in this?
Well, I was a German student at the University of Minnesota, and close to graduation, fairly close to graduation. And I had worked for a couple of years at Vecchio's in Dinkytown, and quit that job just before finals, probably my either junior or senior year, I can't recall, to study and make sure that I got everything completed to my satisfaction. And so at the end of that set of finals and classes and so forth. I still had to eat and pay rent, so I started to look for a job. I believe I went to the job postings at the University of Minnesota, and there was German restaurant. I thought, well, you know, German major, German restaurant makes a little bit of sense. And so I took the bus over from southeast Minneapolis and interviewed with Gerhard. Erich was off at, he had to serve at least, I think, 2 weeks a year for several years after being in the Army, so he was off doing his duty there with the Army, and so I talked just to Gerhard at that time, and I don't think that people were flooding in for this particular job at the time, but he was very carefully interviewed me and decided that it might be all right, so.
And so what was your job? What were you hired for?
I was hired as a server.
And what year would this have been? About?
I'm going to say 66 or 67.
Okay. Hello? Oh, I'm gonna pause this for a sec.
Hello.
Anyone there?
Must be dropping off rent.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Gone. Okay, back up to it. So 66 or 67 when you
Right.
started working
Right.
at the Black Forest Inn. I want to back up just a little bit
Mhm.
and ask you about your decision to major in German.
Well, I was very undecided about what I would do from the get-go, and enjoyed a lot of things. As a sophomore, I decided to take off my spring quarter and summer and travel to Germany and look up relatives, hopefully get a job, and just spend a little time. And that process kind of awakened an interest in language and in languages, and German came fairly easily to me, and so it seemed natural. It seemed at least a comfortable fit at the time. So that's when at that time in my sophomore year, that's when I declared my major and continued with it.
So it was partly, obviously, because you had this very personal, I mean, you are German.
Right.
Right? Your father's family was in Germany.
Mhm.
Did you see it as, prior to that, how important was your German identity to you? Or your German kind of Austro-Hungarian, Polish identity to you?
Hardly important at all, because most everybody was like that. Everybody was a mixture of various things, and we just assumed that that's how people came, you know, and it mattered less what each individual person was, what that makeup was, mattered less than that we were all made up in this way, in you know, of mixtures of people who came from elsewhere, really. It was just assumed.
And Germans were, and I think right now, maybe not the most dominant immigrant group to Minnesota, but they were for a long time.
Right.
The largest immigrant group to Minnesota.
That's
Did
right.
you have a sense of being, did your family have a sense of being part of this wider German American community in Minnesota?
No, not at all.
Okay. I'm gonna pause this one more time. We have somebody from in here.
I'm sorry for interrupting. I just get a public. Sorry for that.
Post back there, right? Please don't come in. All right, well, hopefully that's it. We'll just get back to it.
And
The German American community in Minnesota.
right, and you know, my friends were Norwegian and Slavic, and as far as, at least in my young years, it wasn't an issue at all. It just wasn't. We were just a bunch of kids running around. We didn't pay attention much to that. Certainly not in my own family, but I didn't sense it really in the families around.
And did that change? Did your sense of your kind of ethnic heritage, that identity as a German American, change while you were in school and pursuing a German language degree?
Well, I think as it should be, my mind was opened up to the possibility that the world had a lot of perspectives, and German was one. I think I was more involved in understanding that than I was in finding my own place in that. And I think that my own place in that German heritage, that came really quite a bit later, and partly through marrying Irish, and then, you know, there were two different families, and I think at least some members of his family were a little more interested in that, in maintaining the German kind of traditions and so forth, or at least were more conscious of it because they were actually immigrants. So that came later, I think.
Okay, so let's then segue into you and Irish. So you start working at the Black Forest in 66, 67, and what year do you and Irish marry?
In 1968.
Okay, so it was
Yeah.
relatively quick.
Right, and we were pretty young for today's standards. He was 28, I was 22 at the time we got married.
Okay, so what year was Irish born?
He was born in 1939.
Okay.
Yeah.
And how many kids do you have?
We have 4.
4. And can you tell us their names and the order in which they come? Or
Yes,
came?
yeah. Erica is the eldest, born in 1969, and Gina was born in 1970, and Annalise was born in 1972, and Thomas was born in 1985.
So what do you remember about your first day, or if not your first day, but your early work at the Black Forest Inn? Did you like it? What were your thoughts? What did you do?
Well, it was interesting and exotic. I had grown up in southeast Minneapolis, which the University of Minnesota is also in southeast Minneapolis. So I hadn't really, other than my foray off to Germany and traveling around Europe, I hadn't gotten around very much. And it was quite different from southeast Minneapolis. It was, for one thing, heavily dominated by the Art Institute. The Children's Theater at the time was just starting to coalesce and build, and the art school were really strong, a strong presence in whatever the psyche of the neighborhood was. It was also very much a neighborhood, and so there were people whose ties were deep and were broad and had gone back a ways in the life of South Minneapolis. There was a neighbor hardware store two kind of what at the time were older men, whose father, I think, had started the hardware store. So they were really fixtures. There was a gas station down the street, kind of the same situation. People, older men who'd been there for a long time. So there was this strong sense of neighborhood, and that was kind of interesting. And it was a little kind of sophisticated in a way. I mean, it was rough sophistication, but it was sophistication, particularly some of the artists who would come in, who just were very interesting characters.
And I have two follow-up questions to that. One of which is about the neighborhood. You said there was a real distinct neighborhood feel here in Whittier. Was that different than in Southeast, where you had grown up?
I think so. I think so, because the university was sort of omnipresent there. I grew up in a neighborhood in southeast Minneapolis, down in the Como area, which now is pretty much dominated by the university. But at that time, it was only a smattering of university people for the most part. That was more the Prospect Park area that the university culture dominated. So that I experienced with very much my child's eyes, you know, as an adult, and being involved with the University of Minnesota, the neighborhood changed quite a bit to being kind of highly focused on the university, kind of inward looking, I thought. I mean, compared to coming over here, it just, the world felt a little bigger over here than it did over there.
Now, so when you married, you and Erich married, did you also live in Whittier? Were you
Yes.
actually?
Yes.
Okay, so you did your business and you were living in the
Yes,
neighborhood as well.
right.
So you were thoroughly part of it in both
Yes.
respects.
Until 1970, there must have been something about that year. But we bought a house which is a little outside of Whittier, to the west. But up until that point, we'd lived in apartments in Whittier.
And do you still live in the same house?
Yes.
Same, okay, so
Mhm.
for all those years, okay. So tell me a little bit about the actual physical space of the Black Forest Inn and what you think is unique about it, or what kinds of renovations you've done. How important is that space to the Black Forest Inn?
Well, it seems that by happenstance, I don't think anybody thought ahead very much. I think, you know, they were just making maybe one foolish decision after another that worked out fairly well. But it had been a flourishing restaurant in probably the 30s and the 40s. And there seemed to be something kind of meaningful about that history for the people who could remember it. It was, the woman who ran it was called Nellie Stevens, and she must have been quite a character, because people would talk about, the days of Nellie Stevens, and just physically, there was a part of the building that had obviously been at one time a kitchen, and that had fallen into disuse through all those years of it kind of floundering for an existence. It had been in between. When she ran it, I think it was probably a good restaurant. It very possibly was a speakeasy during the time of the Prohibition, and I think it did definitely get one of the original 3-2 beer licenses once the Prohibition ended. And so there was kind of an atmosphere in there, somewhere deep in those walls and floors and ceilings, of a place that was a gathering point for the community, I think. And after a few years of selling beer to the locals and making little bratwurst and Deutschburgers out of a little closet for the people who wanted to get a bite to eat when they came in, and Erich beginning to flex his muscles as a cook and trained cook and butcher. He discovered that this terrazzo or whatever tile floor in the back, and decided that, well, yes, that really ought to be a kitchen, and started to, piece by piece, a little bit of the old structure kind of revealed itself, and he filled it with equipment, a broiler and a stove, basically. That's all you need in many ways. I think a French fryer came in handy later when people decided that French fries would also go well with whatever it was. So he just kind of patched a kitchen together and began to provide maybe a dozen dishes, some of them very much from his own repertoire, from his recollection, and to some extent from his own family kitchen. And I think the vision was of casual dining. He did not have the idea that he should have, grow into a real fine dining restaurant. I think from the beginning, the sense was it should be something that is for everybody, not for a select few. And I think that particular sentiment, the artistic community around here definitely supported and encouraged and was grateful for. And this was a time in the culinary history of Minneapolis when there really was not much of that. It was really a city in terms of food of extremes. It was either what was sort of known as the supper club kind of dining for when you got all dressed up and pretended to be somebody. And then at the other end of the scale were the little very, very inexpensive sort of counter dining kind of thing. So really, that the concept of good homemade from scratch food that everybody could really appreciate and enjoy was just beginning to be valued, I think. And of course, at the same time, you have women working more and more and more and ever more outside of the home. And the whole idea of the world is getting smaller with lots of, at first television and just, far-flung wars and whatever it is that causes people to look around at the world and see that everything's closer than thought. So we were very well positioned in that sense to satisfy the needs of the local community and to kind of be part of a curiosity about food and culture.
So it sounds like there were a couple of trends or factors that supported the growth of the Black Forest Inn, one of which was very local, that you were in a very well-established neighborhood with these artists who were looking for good, affordable food, but also, as you just described, this kind of growing cultural awareness about the world kind of shrinking because it was more accessible.
Right.
And both of those things.
Right.
So how did it start? I mean, was business good right away? Did the Black Forest Inn, and before you arrived and then in your early years of being there, was it successful? Did you have good business?
Not at first. It was a very hard slog at first. When I first got there, it was really, it was kind of a one-person show almost. One person could just about do everything and did at times do everything. If Erich wanted to take some time off, I would cook the brats or the hamburger or whatever it was that needed to be done while he left. In the very early years, somewhere in there, Will Jones was a columnist for the Minneapolis Star, and he wrote a big piece about the Black Forest Inn in the Minneapolis paper, which was it was a big deal at that time. And there was one food critic and everybody listened, and they had a big picture, and really in a sense from that moment on things just went up, really sharply up. So much so that we just had to scramble to keep up. We had to buy more dishes, we had to buy more pots, we had to hire more people, we had to wash more dishes, we had to hire more people. You know, it was meteoric, really, for a short period of time. And of course, you know, after a while it tapered off, but it was dramatic. I mean, and that was kind of the illustration of what I was saying. People were, in a sense, they were ready for it. And German food is, it's ethnic, but it's also home cooking for some people. There are a lot of people with grandparents or parents or aunts or uncles, and then a lot of men who, and some women as well, who were stationed in Germany for the various times during, and then for a lot of years post-war, there was a big American presence in Germany. So it was kind of exotic enough, but not as exotic as what we, you know, fortunately get to choose from now.
And I absolutely do not expect that you have this date in your head, but do you know roughly when that article came out in the Star Tribune? I can certainly find it.
Yeah,
Late 60s?
I think maybe late 60s, yeah,
Okay. I'll have to go find it. That's
yeah.
So yes, when you're talking about how the food that the Black Forest Inn served kind of echoed or mirrored what a lot of people had at home, was that the same for you? Was it the food that you grew up eating at home?
Not at all, no.
What did you eat at home?
We ate simple things. We ate pork chops and spaghetti, and we ate American food. We had Jell-O. You know,
So kind of that post-World War II,
yes,
all-American
yep,
cuisine. At
that's
home.
right, that's right.
Let's see. So let's talk a little bit about the food,
Okay.
about the menu. How has it changed over the years, besides expanding, which it has quite dramatically?
Yeah.
It started with about 12 dishes.
Right. Well, as I said, Irish really drew from his own experience to start out. So by the time I was on the scene, there were, some of the mainstays were there. The schnitzels, Wiener schnitzels, and sauerbraten, if I'm recalling correctly, I think was already there. Sauerbraten, for example, he had these great big ceramic pots filled with vinegar and all kinds of spices, and he was marinating them in the cooler. So he had those mainstays. German potato salad. We purchased our bratwurst from a local source at that time, and it was good. Schweigert, I think it was. Schweigert still exists as a name, doesn't exist the way it did then. It was a real sausage maker and, you know, a local provider of various kinds of meats. And then, and as I said, there was then a period of time where all we could do was kind of run to catch up. And then we started to be a little bit more deliberate, and maybe I brought to the family business a little bit of the possibility of researching. So we started to acquire some books, and at the time there weren't very many American English books of German food, but we used what we could that we could get from Germany and what we had, and started to do a little bit more research. And then we would attempt a little more, you know, broader take from what's German food. I mean, Irish is like almost any country, the food is very regional. So his food was very much Mannheim kind of food.
And what is Mannheim kind of food? Like what are representative Mannheim dishes?
Well, Mannheim is kind of at the top of the of what's southern, you know, toward the northern end, certainly the northern side of the Black Forest. And so Spätzle, the tiny egg noodles, are kind of on the table, all kinds of dumplings, a lot of food, a lot of meats with gravies, stews, and so forth. Peasant, typical German household food,
What people would eat at home.
what people would eat at home at that time, yeah.
And so when you say that, then when, after you had started and been there for a while, you were doing some research.
Right.
And again, was that into different regional cuisines of German food?
Mhm, more so, yes, and just the different layers, and maybe branching out into Austria, and a little bit also Hungarian food, and you know, just trying to encompass a little bit bigger range. Partly, you know, there's just this creative side to everybody that has to branch out, and restaurants are strange in that way. They're open to endless amounts of creativity. I don't think you can ever have enough. Part of it has to do with the product, and part of it has to do with people and the way people change and people's differences and so forth. But what also happens is that people get very set in their expectations. So they come in, they had this wonderful thing, they come in, they want to have that wonderful thing exactly the way the wonderful thing was the last time they were here, even if that was 20 years ago. So there is a kind of there's that creativity, and then there's the kind of don't rock the boat sort of thing that happens probably in everybody's lives to some extent, but it was a real issue. But we just have to, if you're going to stay in this business for that long, you have to have an outlet for that creativity. So we just had to play with our food a little bit.
So how much, you raised the point about customers' expectations when they come to the Black Forest Inn. Tell me a little bit about the customers of the Black Forest Inn. Have they been mostly local folks? Have they been people coming specifically for German food? How has that changed?
The definition of local has changed because there are now so many restaurants. There are more restaurants than people, I think, in the city of Minneapolis, or the cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul. So it was local. I think the people who were specifically looking for German food were probably in a minority. I think the majority of people were local. They were a real cross-section variety of people from Minneapolis and St. Paul. I think you could say they were the people who were looking to try something new, who were just happy to have a place to gather and rub shoulders with one another. In the early years, and when we were so terribly busy, we would seat people, as they do in Europe still to this day, we would seat people together who didn't know one another. So we had round tables, and sometimes you'd end up with three groups of two, or a four and a two sitting together. People really enjoyed that for a while. I don't know how it would, I can't quite imagine it today, maybe in limited circumstances. And some new places a lot of places actually have kind of like bars set up for people who come in and might look for a little bit of that. But at that time, the people accepted it, and sometimes it was marvelous. I mean, people just had a great time and got to know people they would never have run into. So there was that social element too, of just, here's a place to go, and we can go any night of the week, and we can afford to do it on a semi-regular basis, and people availed themselves of that. And I think it was not the German or German Americans who made it go. I think it was the urban, the urban people, the kind of movers and shakers of the time, not in a snobbish sense, but in a sense of the people who were out and about and doing what other people were doing and rubbing shoulders with one another.
Do you think that the customers over the years have shaped the food that you offer or how you prepare it?
Yeah, but that's tricky too, because you know, there's the integrity of what we make that we have to guard. Nobody, well, no, I shouldn't say nobody else will, but there's only some of the population who really has that kind of knowledge and experience. And you know, people just kind of want more, so you do have to kind of rein that in a little bit too. But certainly the response of people is of utmost importance. You know, if people say, I love that dish, please don't take it off, or please do that again. Well, that's persuasive, and that happens all the time. Yeah, and it continues to happen.
Is there a dish that you would consider the Black Forest Inn signature dish?
Well, I think it would be hard not to say that it's Erish's bratwurst, which he makes himself. I think that's the thing that really you can't get it anyplace else. It's not easy to do, and it's good. You know, it's just delicious, and you know, pair it with German potato salad or sauerkraut, and we make the rye bread. We make our own rye bread. So I'd say that's the one. That's the pivot point. And then there are several others that are pretty high up there as well. But
Like what? What are those?
Sauerbraten, I think Sauerbraten and Spätzle. You know, we make a kind of a mean Reuben sandwich and have for a long time, and there's a lot of people who do love that. Schnitzels, we deal with veal. There aren't too many places that do, and they're delicious. Then there are several kinds of schnitzels that are big. We do a nice potato pancake. We have a dish called sauerkraut balls, which is kind of it's really way more American than it is German, but it's good and people like it, and people will come back for that. And that is a dish that I actually was traveling in Texas, in San Antonio, walking along the river walk, and I ran into I stopped to have a cup of coffee, and there was a woman a couple of tables away who was chatty, and you know, we got to talking, and she said, what do you do? And I said, well, my husband and I run a German restaurant in Minneapolis. And she said, well, you've just got to take this recipe and try it. I just know it's going to be, you know, people will love it. I cook in a such and such a restaurant, and so that was the sauerkraut balls, and I did bring it back, and you know, it's been on the menu ever since.
Have you tried anything, whether it was in terms of the dishes or the food that you serve, or just business gestures, that has failed?
Oh, all the time. I think if we didn't have failures, we wouldn't exist. And you know, we probe at the edges with things like head cheese, or you know, kidneys are on the menu, and they've been on the menu for a long time. They're not a big seller, but you know, there are people who, for them, it's the only place they'll ever be able to get that sort of thing. And I can't even mention, you know, recall all the things that we've tried, and people just said, what is this? And so off you go to try something else.
Now, do you cook at home?
Oh yeah,
So
definitely.
is what you cook at home similar to what you offer at the restaurant, or very different?
Both. I mean, Erich is a wonderful cook, and he, certainly for big events, he always will cook the main dish, all of our, Christmas and Thanksgiving and all of that sort of thing. And I'm not a great cook, but I want to try something new all the time. So we will do things that are Asian or I don't know, just experimental, if I get my hands into the cooking pot. So we do all kinds of stuff. Cooking is a good part of our life. And now, it used to be when we were younger and maybe more competitive, we went out a lot and we'd find out what everybody else was doing. And then, of course, you do learn things and you bring them back. Now we tend to do that kind of, satisfy that parts of our brain by working at home and trying different things.
So what is your daily involvement in the restaurant now? What do you do?
Well, it's, I work in the back. I do bring my suggestions and ideas. I do still do research, and I'll do book work. I will clean out the bathrooms. I've probably done maybe 1 billion dishes in my life. So, it's just that's kind of the nature of business, is that where something opens up and it isn't being taken care of, you run in and you take care of it. So I don't make as many decisions as I used to. We have kids who are involved, and I really want them to have the freedom to make the decisions about hiring and about doing special projects, having special events, and they're very, very good at it, and I, just as soon that they do that.
Are all 4 of your kids involved?
In one way or the other, and over limited periods of time, they all are. Yeah, they all kind of.
Have any of them made it their main business, their main job to be part of the restaurant?
I think that not exactly. They each have a very important kind of another life going on. And I think that time will tell whether they decide that they would like to do the restaurant in our absence or not. At this point, I think they would rather not, and they each have a good, vigorous side, something going on, and it'll be up to them, and it's not, it won't be my business in that sense. We'll see. But I think at any given time, it's been the sole source of funds for any of them, and it's perhaps not now. When they're involved, they're fully involved. They really are. It's not that they're holding back, it's that they have other things that are also important, if it's be it writing or studying or theater. There are just things that are very important to them that they also are exercising their energies toward, which is a good thing. I think the sort of single-mindedness that we brought to the business, I think you only have to do that once, in a sense, and their life is, their world is different. Their world is much more quick on your feet, make decisions, move. If you look at restaurants now, it's really, does it work? No, close it down, start another one. So the world is different. And I respect that, and we'll see what happens with
Did
the
they all
restaurant.
work in the restaurant when they were teenagers?
Of course. And actually, our my eldest grandson is going to be 13 soon, and they dabble. They'll come in and, put labels on postcards or do whatever little things in the restaurant, which is a thrill to them at this point. So
How many staff do you have total?
I think right now we probably have about 20 or 22.
And talk a little bit about your staff, how you find them, how long they stay, what role they play in the success of Black Forest Inn.
Well, we have some people who've been around for quite a few years, maybe 30 and 20 and 15. That's, a small number, but they're very important. They have the corporate memory, they have the understanding of the place and all the players, including, customers and suppliers and the family, of course. And so there's sort of a steady, even keel of people. And then maybe 25% or so where it's constantly changing. A lot of students or people who've recently moved into the area, or people whose life has changed in one way or the other. We tend to be kind of transitional for a lot of people. It's a comfortable way to kind of change direction for many people. So in the early years, in the 60s, we had a lot of people who were from the outward appearance, very much the hippie culture, and very capable people who did some spectacular things in those early years and really served the place and the neighborhood and the customers very well. And every generation brings its own kind of stamp and style, and so it's important. I mean, the staff it's a big deal.
So you've had this group of staff people who have been with you for a long time. Do you also, I would assume, have customers that have been with you for many years?
Definitely.
And can you speculate as to what percentage of your customer base are regulars who come in and they are going to keep coming in?
Oh, no, I guess that would be hard for me to say. I think the definition of regular would change from person to person, from family to family. I mean, there's people who come in and say, I haven't been here for 5 years, who consider themselves kind of a regular customer, or at least to have some sense of ownership of the place. So and then there's people who come in almost every day. Not very many, but there are people who do that. And there's a very solid Friday night group. There are the Saturday night people, and some really very regular. There's a lot of, I think maybe more than ever, there's kind of people who come for mixed reasons, like we're going to the children's theater, then we'll all go to the Black Forest before or after, or symphony, or going to the Institute, or that sort of thing. We're part of the routine of some people.
So they're making it a whole evening rather than just going out to eat.
Right.
Just going.
And that's one of the privileges of having been around a long time, is that we're associated then with various events and cultural kinds of things. And we do a few things within house too. My eldest daughter has storytelling events once a month, and there's a movie. There's a man who was interested in showing old movies, and that happens on a regular basis, particularly in the winter, but more and more, and there's a little following. There are little musical recitals or events that happen in our banquet space. So some of those integration of eating out and doing something happen within our own space as well.
Well, I noticed there's a flyer out here on the door for something that's happening tonight.
Oh, really?
Right, March 7th.
Yeah.
There's a reading or a talk or something happening.
Right,
for us.
right.
So.
And there's quite a bit of that. And now we have people who are going to have donuts at Glamdall. Come to the Black Forest and eat and stop and have a donut. So it's nice to have those connections. Recently, the show at the Institute, the Martin Luther show, was an incredible draw for people they heard the name Martin Luther and Institute of Art, which is like 4 blocks from us, and the Black Forest came to mind, and we had group after group after group of Martin Luther visitors who decided that would make it a kind of a full kind of event to appreciate Martin Luther and some of the food he may have eaten back in the day.
Make the whole experience.
Yeah.
All right, so we're going to shift gears here a little bit.
Kim, can I stop you just for
Yeah.
10 seconds?
Yep.
I just want to double check my second camera.
Sure.
All right. Go ahead.
Ready? Okay.
Yep. Thanks.
Okay, so I want to shift gears a little bit and start talking about, because we're so involved in the revitalization of Nicollet Avenue, of Whittier as a whole, and helping to turn it into what we now know as Ead Street.
Mhm.
You already talked a little bit about what the neighborhood was like
Mhm.
when the Black Forest Inn began, but say a few more words about Whittier and what that was like in the early years of the Black Forest Inn.
Mhm. Well, we were so involved in our own little world that there was a lot that was going on around us within blocks and miles that didn't register right away. But times did change I think primarily in the 80s. I think, I'm not going to be just perfect about dates and times, but there was somewhere in those decades, the street changed. I think that there were a lot of the businesses along Nicollet Avenue were satellite businesses to downtown. There was sort of a tiered system of doing business. There was the downtown big banks and the tall office buildings and so forth. And then there were a lot of allied businesses that kind of located along these, probably along Central and along Nicollet and to some extent Franklin and Lake Street, that served a lot of the sort of satellite functions to the bigger ones downtown. And I think that connection kind of ended at some point in there. It just wasn't working so much, or maybe businesses were consolidating more so into becoming bigger businesses, and so a lot of businesses along Nicollet Avenue were disappearing. I mean, they just were going, and there was also maybe a little bit of a fear developing of inner cities at the time, and there was if not a reality, there was a sense of cities being more scary places for people to go. And, we would get the question a lot of times in those years, are you going to stay where you are? Are are you frightened? You know, is it hard to do business? And, you know, gradually something changed in the atmosphere from it being a very nice, high-functioning neighborhood. Transient, to be sure. I mean, there's a lot of apartments in Whittier. It's not home ownership dominated. It's dominated by people who do come and go. They used to come and go much more slowly. You know, maybe there'd be a decade where they'd live in apartments and establish themselves in careers and, you know, setups, more permanent living setups and so forth. And that transition has sped up a bit, and there was a time when this part of town was thought of as dangerous or risky, or at least unknown for a lot of people. And there was a move to the suburbs, and people, and it changed, you know, things changed. And we sort of didn't notice it because we were busy and people were seeking us out. And
So did you ever think about leaving or relocating?
not really. I mean, not because of anything heroic, but because we were established, we were doing well in our little spot. We were definitely what would have been called a business a place that you would be intent to go to, and you would go to, not necessarily accidentally stop by, you know. But for all of that, we were doing fine. In many ways, we were doing very well. But meanwhile, things around us were crumbling a bit. One of the kind of unfortunate things at that period of time was the city's decision to close Nicollet. And that really was scary for us, because it really felt as though we were going to be cut off, and there was going to be just this sort of, you know, amputated part of Minneapolis that people were just going to fly around, because, you know, the street was closed, and there was this growing sense of unease about how scary the neighborhood might be. And the closing of Nicollet, on the one hand, it was scary, and it was terribly ill-advised. You know, the city just made a boneheaded decision to do that. And
did they solicit feedback from you?
Just a little bit. I mean, there was objection. There were people with placards out walking up and down the street. But I believe there was a sense of desperation in the city, and that was kind of either do that or things would get worse, you know. And I suppose from their point of view, they saw this as city renewal. You know, this was going to be something great and would stem the tide. We certainly didn't see it that way, and I don't think it's borne out very well. But it did also galvanize the neighborhood to some extent. So I think, you know, Whittier as a viable political unit might have, in a sense, gotten some sort of rocket power from that decision.
So this is the 40th year of the Whittier Alliance, which would mean it started in 77, and I think Kmart came in like 78, right? So it would have been right around
Yes.
that time
Yeah.
that things were happening.
Yeah.
So yeah, what did happen once Nicollet closed? Did it affect your business?
I don't think I'd have to go back and look at numbers, but I don't think that we noticed a direct effect, other than it was confusing to get to the restaurant. So there was a lot of, now, where are you and how do you get there, particularly from the south, obviously, because it's cut off right there. And I think that the neighborhood, it didn't deteriorate in some rapid sense. I think that there's maybe an area right around the back end of Kmart that kind of didn't know what it was there for a while, and the streets are funny, and it took a while for a few businesses to really establish there. Yeah, so, and I don't know, I mean, it's hard to really judge what effect what is having on what. I think it might have affected the south end of Nicollet more so in some ways, and Lake Street itself. I mean, that area right there, that Lakes and Nicollet area is just not very pleasant, and I don't, you know, I think it may have suffered more directly than we did.
So you've talked about the closing of Nicollet at Lake Street with Kmart coming in, which was late 70s.
Mm-hmm.
And then the kind of disappearance of these satellite businesses
Mhm.
along Nicollet Avenue in the maybe early to mid 80s.
Mm-hmm.
So what effect did that have on the neighborhood? Whether it's from those things or other forces,
Mhm.
other factors, how was the neighborhood changing so that you and others in the neighborhood decided that, you know, you needed to do something?
Well, I think it was, one of the things was that it just was looking not very good. A lot of the storefronts were not just, it just wasn't inviting, and I think we probably got a little bit of a inferiority complex from the sort of the idea, the things, the way news was reported and so forth. We were looked at as a kind of a tough part of town, a dangerous part of town, and to some extent we looked like that. At the same time, I guess the first wave of immigration would have happened about then from Asia. So these very interesting, exotic, but not enticing looking little restaurants and grocery stores and maybe a little bit of jewelry, you know, something, and hair salons and so forth would pop up, and you'd look at it and think, ooh, that's kind of interesting, but I don't know if I'd know what to do if I walked in there, and would they understand? You know, there was just these beginning smatterings of people coming in who were bringing something exotic to the neighborhood.
So these were the folks who were replacing all these businesses that
Yes,
had left.
you're right. And of course, rents were reasonable, and that was obvious to the people who were opening the businesses as well, that this was a good way to get started if you had almost nothing to start. So that, yeah, that started, and they could do it with their own communities. They didn't really have to interact too much with other people. It wasn't like a shopping center or something where you really had to have a little bit of negotiation skill and ability to even get in there and get going. Here you could just talk to somebody, and the landlords were willing to either sell or rent, and the people were very anxious to get going and get a foothold and start to be of service to their own communities for the most part. I mean, I think probably from the get-go they were very willing and able to deal with all of us, everybody who lived here, but mainly they were supporting one another at that time, and doing so with a very, very low profile. There's the fewer waves that were made, the less that was asked of them, the better from their point of view. Just let us alone and we'll do business, and we'll do fine, thank you.
Now, and this kind of goes back to what you were saying earlier about media reports about this part of the city and just this increasing fear of the inner city. And I remember that, having grown up in Minneapolis, that this part of town did have that particular reputation for a while, and that it was not safe,
Mhm.
that there was crime in
Mhm.
the neighborhood. Was that a reality, or?
Well, it was as much a reality as it was for most other parts of the city. I think the reality was we certainly look a little rougher, tougher than Southdale or, Brookdale or whatever, for people who didn't look much deeper than that. We did not suffer tons of crime that any more than I think you would expect in just the day-to-day operation of business. So I wouldn't say that it was crime infested. The thing about the kind of crime that happened is that it moves around in little pockets. So if you just look at a certain block of Whittier at that time, it could look like a terrible area, because the same, these are people who were whatever, dealing in drugs or had a theft ring or whatever. They establish a foothold. There are tons of calls for the police to go there. So there was that sort of thing. There probably still is that sort of thing. And it's probably more likely to happen in a transient area than it is in where it's mostly home ownership. So in a sense, it can be a wish-fulfilling prophecy. Crime does happen, and sometimes it's very ugly, and it is scary. But I don't think that this neighborhood was crime infested in any way.
So tell us a little bit about when you and the Toms started really thinking, we need to do something to improve the neighborhood of Nicollet Avenue.
Right. The Whittier Alliance actually rented the space that's now our banquet space for many years, so we were very conversant with Whittier. I was not highly involved. I would do some things, but we were kind of concentrated on our own little thing. But I'd listen to what was going on, and I wasn't completely uninformed. I just wasn't in there to the extent that, like, my daughter is now and so forth. But by virtue of having been there for a long time, I think, and being easily accessible, Tom Berthume, who is a photographer and has owned some property since then. I don't know if he still does or not. And Tom George, who is a resident and was very involved they were both involved in Whittier Alliance much more actively than I. The two of them came to me, in my recollection, they came to me and said, would you join us in looking at our neighborhood kind of with fresh eyes, because we're just concerned about the way it looks, and let's just be honest with each other and ourselves about what's Whittier. And so Tom, with his photography skills, went out and took more or less panoramic pictures of up and down Nicollet and a few other streets, I think Franklin and perhaps 26th, and blew these pictures up into large size and set them up nicely, as I recall, on easels and wherever else, so that you could kind of walk along and experience the street as it would look to somebody with fresh eyes, or to somebody who walks it all the time. But certainly to take our attention, to put our attention on what that looks like, because I think you can walk past things for a lifetime and not really look at them. And his taking photos helped me anyway to really look at what what it looks like to people who look at it as a commercial possibility. This is here you could maybe come and do some business, and what does it look like? Well, there were some nice bright spots, but it didn't look very good as a whole. And you'd go from window to storefront to window to to things closed to things really not maintained very well. And in the process, we decided that it would be a good thing to work on that, to just work on what it looks like. And so the idea was born of doing a streetscape improvement project and working with the Whittier Alliance in doing that. And coincidentally, at the same time, the city had started to work with the neighborhood revitalization project and was funding different types of projects, and neighborhoods were encouraged to look at their own neighborhood and use those funds in the way that suits that neighborhood best. And so I think the two Toms, being more politically astute, kind of recognized that that might be an opportunity for us to look at not just housing, but also the commercial stock, the commercial side of things. What is it that we maybe could do to improve that? Because there was a structure. I mean, one of the things that we also saw as we walked past all of these pictures was a kind of an amazing variety of restaurant and food options. Really, really very interesting and unusual. And by this time, it wasn't just Asian, it was also Latin American and Mexican, it was Middle Eastern, it was Greek. There were just things had happened while we weren't watching that were very interesting. And still, it still remained that a lot of them were looking kind of inward, kind of like we were, I guess, and weren't aware that they were in a community of kind of like-minded people who were each one kind of struggling and surviving on very close margins and very, very, very hard work. So there was that, there were two things revealed. One was we didn't look very good, and two was, but there was a gold mine here of some sort for at least, talking about that, the early change in people's perception of what's available to them food-wise, and just culturally, everybody's world was expanding, and here was this just lovely parade of places illustrating that very fact. We weren't really talking to one another. Each one of us thought we were an island unto itself, and we were in many ways. But it was fascinating when you looked at it. And then we started to count it out. And it seems to me we came up with something over 50 food-related outlets in a fairly, within about 12 blocks or 14 blocks or whatever. So that was kind of stunning. And we did feel, or gradually began to have a sense that was enough, that in itself could be something. It didn't look.
You're going to kind of shape up the appearance of the neighborhood and
Yeah.
reform its image, that you could
Right.
do it around this.
Right.
What you've just noticed through this photo shoot, that you have, as you say, this kind of gold mine.
Right.
Just
A
here.
commercially various, exciting, interesting little theater up and down the street.
And it happened to be at the time where this money was available.
And there happened to be,
Through the city.
that's right, there happened to be that. And so partway into and we started to talk about it, and it seemed like, as I recall, Whittier Alliance was amenable to using some of that money to help the commercial parts of this community, and that's not always an easy argument to make, because it's people's hearts are in their homes, and if there's a choice between housing, helping out people to have homes, and helping people to run their businesses, there's a definite bias toward homes, and I suppose that's sort of understandable. But in this case, we felt that this would probably be beneficial not only to the businesses themselves, but to the community, to the city, to the people who lived around here. I mean, these are amenities, and if you look at it from a certain perspective, we're definitely amenities. And then partway through that discussion, we felt that it was Whittier's end at Franklin was a little unnatural to what we were looking at. We really started to concentrate more or less on Nicollet Avenue, and kind of with the realization that where the downtown mall ended would be a much better, much more natural place for a break between downtown and this wonderful Nicollet Avenue that was developing in a completely different way from its old method. So we started to talk about the possibility of including the Stevens neighborhood, which is from Franklin to the freeway there, and then the Loring neighborhood from the freeway down to Grant Street, or where the convention center is. And we felt pretty strongly that if we were going to do a streetscape renovation that was going to be expensive and very interruptive of our own commerce, I mean, we were really going to subject ourselves to some long time of a lot of trouble getting our customers where we wanted them to be. So we kind of figured if we were to do this, one, we had this opportunity of some cash from NRP to help make this happen. And we had this natural growth all along Nicollet, all the way down to downtown Minneapolis. And then the kind of public perception, the sort of seedy and unsavory perception of the neighborhood, looking at all three of those things, it would really serve us better if we would involve not only Whittier, but also those other two neighborhoods. And we did work fairly hard to make that happen.
Were they eager and willing?
I think Stevens more so. Loring was a little reluctant. I think their loyalties are torn between downtown and our direction. And
Because of 94 being kind of this division.
right. And because they're right there. I mean, on that end of it, the Hyatt and whatever that hotel across the way is called now, sit right there, and they sort of mark the end of downtown, and that's just really walking distance from that Loring neighborhood. So they were much more reluctant. They did, in the end decide that there was more benefit than not, but I think still to some extent their eyes are fixed toward downtown a little bit more so.
So for this streetscape project, did most or all of the money come from NRP funds, or did you have to bring other funds to the project as well?
Well, typically, if a project like this occurs, the taxpayers, the building owner, the property owners pay it. They pay 100%. And of course, there are just not a lot of wealthy property owners along here. So what we saw as the reality was it was going to be a hard sell to property owners to put something like this through on their backs. The normal course of events for this sort of thing is the city puts various streets on its calendar, and the city then comes to this whatever area it is and makes its presentation and has hearings and then kind of bullies it through, pushes it through. So this was, for the city of Minneapolis, this was kind of a new thing. We came as an organization and said, we're ready, we need it, will you come and help us? Rather than the city coming and saying, you know, we'll see you with our big trucks and, you know, just be ready, and then after that you'll pay the bill. Which of course we did pay the bill. Most of it was assigned to the various property owners, and they do it over time, and you know, it's the way through tax assessments that have a lifespan, you know, of whatever number of years it is. They do all that calculating, and we pay, we write the checks. But the idea that the property owners could handle all of this that probably wouldn't have flown. It wasn't palatable. We would have gotten very much a compromised improvement. As it was, the city came to the table, and the county came to the table, and the state of Minnesota came to the table. So in a way, those little NRP funds really bore a lot of fruit, just because we had a little more than just what the property owners could pony up. The city was persuaded that it should, you know, pull out whatever resources it could find, and did find through other sources, because it is a thoroughfare. I mean, although alas, it comes to a screeching halt at Kmart, it's still in part county and in part state. Nicollet is essentially the bisecting street of the city of Minneapolis. East divides east from west in the city of Minneapolis. So it's a big thoroughfare.
Do you have a sense, and again, I don't expect that you have exact numbers off the top of your head, but do you have a sense for the relative contribution of NRP funds and city-state versus this tax assessment?
I think if I said something, it'd be wrong. I'm you know, somewhere in the 2/3, 1/3, 2/3, the taxpayers 1/3, or 25 or 75, or I don't think 50-50, but you know, I'm sure it's in the yeah.
So do you remember about when, and again, you don't have to worry about specific dates, but the street project, we can go backwards. We know it ends in the summer of 1997, because there's the Blacktop Frolic and the Bebop Parade that celebrates the end of this project in 1997.
Mm-hmm.
How long did it take to do the project? How long was Nicollet all torn up and disrupted?
The project itself, I think maybe a year and a half or two, perhaps, from one end to the other, but I'm not, yeah.
Okay. And what was it like? What was business like during that time? Did it affect your business at all? I mean, we access Black Forest Inn on 26, but it's right there.
Yeah. It's hard to, I don't know. I think it may have, but maybe more so day business, I guess. Just by the time they stopped all the, the digging and moving and whatever all they did, there was always a way through. So I think night business wasn't too much affected, but I think anybody trying to get there in the daytime would have been very frustrated, so.
And what were some of the biggest improvements that project made along Nicollet?
Well, I think the biggest improvement it made was visual. It just looked better. It looked like it was a coherent commercial district. And that was kind of at the top of our list in terms of aesthetics, was keep it very consistent, keep it things that could be maintained over time fairly easily. Because of the fencing and so forth, the parking was identifiable versus just, you know, you'd see an empty space. Is this a parking lot? Isn't it? You know, it was clearly marked. Lighting was huge. I mean, we put in a lot of lights, and we had to, actually, that was one little mini fight, was getting lights that were pedestrian oriented, not higher. They had a certain height that they said, we will not go any lower than such and such, and we said, no, we think these are much more appropriate for a commercial area where people are walking around. That's where you want people to feel safe. That's where you want things to be well lit. It's not about the street and lighting the cars. And so we had to fight that.
Lights would be for traffic.
Well, more so. They were sort of intermediate. They would serve both purposes, and the city thought that made sense, and we were able to prevail on that one. So we were the first one with really the first long expanse like that with you know, more pedestrian oriented lighting, and that was big. Now we also put in a lot of trees, and that looks good. It looks maintained, it looks fresh, it looks like there's life in the area. So I think each one of those things, but mainly it was kind of the overall sense of professionalism and welcome and so forth. I mean, we were really fighting against looking down at the heels and looking rough and scary.
And you've mentioned some already, but were there any other particularly challenging things about getting this project done? Any controversies among those of you who were working on the streetscape project, or was it relatively smooth sailing?
I think it was remarkably smooth sailing, but there were always some details. I mean, we decided, and maybe it was controversial, maybe not, but we decided that street furniture probably would be out. You know, that we didn't want to really encourage people to sit at a bench because we were afraid of drug dealing and so forth. So perhaps that was a controversial decision, but it wasn't too hard for us to make. And that's the sort of thing that could always be added at some other point in the life of the street. I don't think we'd worry about that so much now as it was a concern then. But otherwise, maybe the how far the project reached out into some of the arms of along 26th, along Franklin. We maybe should have at the time gone over to the convention center, and we didn't, and I think it may be that we couldn't. There was something about what that property, who it belonged to or whatever, and 24th Street, which goes over to the Institute, it would have been good to have that be a nice corridor so people could find their way back and forth to the Institute and to Eat Street, but the property owners along there, I think, wouldn't have been prepared or in a position to make the outlays that would have been necessary to make that happen. There were, decisions like that, a little bit on the controversial side, but sooner or later the decision got in all cases, it gets made for you. You know, there's just a certain consensus that's built, or certain realities that you run smack into, and there's nothing more you can do.
So now looking back on it, all these years later, 20 or so years later, do you consider that project a success?
Well, I think it of course, always depends on how you measure success. I would say it's been a resounding success, and part of it is just my own experience of having something that is sort of this combination of the human beings and the, you know, the creative sorts, and the city and the little neighborhood association work together in a way that got something really very lovely accomplished, and really we did what we set out to do in many ways. So I would consider that to be a success. I think maybe a year or so before the project was complete, we decided among ourselves that in order to make this project really bear fruit, that it needed a public relations aspect to it. So we did decide that we would work on that. We would work hard on that. And the first steps were to really find an agency to give us some help, which we did. What I had found, and I did as I started to work on the public relations part, I did a lot of walking up and down the street and talking to each individual business and say, would you consider doing something together? Let's just do something. Let's have a party, or let's have a gift certificate that goes to everybody, or let's declare a day, a certain. It was very difficult. I mean, and I totally understand. If I had been sitting in my business and someone had come through like that, I would have been wary too, and definitely realizing that money is tight. You know, I can't just write you a check because you come with a great story, and that's kind of what I found. And part of there was sometimes a huge language barrier, and I would speak to the younger generation who'd go and translate to the older generation who'd say, I know this person, and are they just feathering their own nest? And there was a distrust of policemen, and there were just certain things that were really a barrier to getting everyone together to do something. So it did become very clear that if we were going to do that, we'd have to get some neutral party, which a PR firm is and became for us, someone who could speak for the group without having a personal interest, which I think at least some people saw with me. We had a solid group of people who understood it and got it and were willing. But to get the whole group together, we needed to be unified from some way that wasn't too close.
Do you remember what agency you worked with?
Well, it was Gabriel, at the time it was Gabriel, Dirks, and Residlo, GDR. They're now called GDB. They had recently broken off from, okay, here's my first, from a big group, a very well-known group. And I really just got on the phone and called the head of that group and said, would you consider doing some pro bono work for us? Because here we are, we've got this wonderful street, we've got this project, we need to work on some sort of sense of identity and on some sense of sort of working in common to present a good smiley face for the rest of the world, because that was what we really wanted to do, was change the perception. And that's what PR firms are good at. And he said to me, yes, we do this sort of thing. I have for many people. I love that area, and I think it's a great idea, but we've got these three people who are spinning off from my group. They're just getting started. Would you give them a call, and here's what you say to them. Tell them they can do what they want. You know, they'll get free rein to kind of make a name for themselves in exchange for doing it pro bono, and they were very willing to do it, and they were very helpful, and that's how the whole Eat Street name and project as its own little entity got it started, was really through them.
Okay, so you were working already before this, and this was before the project was
Before
done?
it ended, I mean, we were
Okay.
starting to see the writing on the wall. It was looking good. We were getting some attention for what was happening, but we were all afraid that we'd get it all in there and everyone would turn around and go back to their little corners, and it would all just gradually.
So we know that Jeremy Igger's article comes out in January of 1997, where he, or as he will insist, perhaps a headline writer at the Star Tribune, designated or referred to this part of Nicollet Avenue as Eats Street.
Right.
Or Eat Street.
Right.
But you had already been working, or at least at that time, by January of 1997, had been working very consciously to think about how you were going to brand, so to speak, this part.
Yeah.
So those two things were kind of coinciding?
Kind of, yes, right.
And then you just decided that, yep, we're gonna use this idea about these restaurants and this particular term and
Yes.
off and running.
We kind of voted. I mean, we had some sort of a meeting, I don't recall exactly, and we had 3 or 4 different names, and Eat Street, and that was, I think, GDB or GDR at the time, took the S off and just called it Eat Street as one of 3 or 4 options, and that one won.
And it's still, people know, when we talk about, oh, I'm gonna go down to Eat Street, people know what it is, they
Yeah.
know where it is. You have the signs along Nicollet Avenue, the big
Yes,
tall ones, and
Right.
other things that
right,
on the street that indicate that you are on Eat Street.
right.
I'm just gonna ask a couple of concluding questions, and then if there's anything else that you wanna talk about that we haven't, we'll have a few minutes to do that too. But I know that one of the things that I've heard from the people at the Whittier Alliance and others that I've been working with on this project, one of the things that I've heard is that other communities around the country have looked to Whittier and Eat Street as a potential model for how they might kind of revitalize their own neighborhoods. Do you have any advice, any lessons learned that you would offer to those people?
Well,
What's important about it, or what do you need to help a neighborhood kind of revitalize?
Well, I think one of the things that is near and dear to my heart in this project is that we really built on what was there. What I see failing in so many developments or redevelopments is that they impose some sense from outside of what it ought to be. And in my mind, and this is really kind of aesthetic, it's not a great insight, but to my mind, they kind of repeat certain tropes or whatever all across, not only across cities, but across nations. And pretty soon all you see is the same thing. You can walk down a city and you really have no sense of what city you're in. And there is no doubt where you are when you're on Eat Street. And what's kind of remarkable is that a lot of places have stayed. I mean, a lot of places that were there then are still here in one way or the other.
And in the restaurant industry, which,
And
as I understand it, has a huge kind of
Turnover,
turnover
huge.
rate.
So that, I think, is up there above all others, is value what's there. And then I think it's just kind of being open to learning what is needed, what do people want, what are people looking for. We had a wonderful display at in one of the envisioning things that Whittier held about the possible opening of Nicollet Avenue, and there was a group of young architecture students who just looked at this intersection, one intersection, and each one made a presentation, and it's just terribly inspiring to hear them talk about not how pretty the outside looks or how, you know, how much better this looks than that, but they really talked about the heart and the soul of the neighborhood. What is it that makes a neighborhood? And that, I guess, if someone were looking at a project like that and saw that there was something of value, to hang on to that, don't let go. And, you know, don't just hand it over to developers to decide, which I think, again, that's too often what happens.
And then I want to just circle back to where we started, and we talked about how a community can kind of look at moving forward. Black Forest has been around for 50 years, which is amazing.
Almost
And
52 now. That's,
yeah, in the restaurant industry. So
Yeah.
what is the secret to your success as a restaurant?
Oh, if I knew that, I think I would be wealthy and you know, flying around looking at communities from the top. You know, it's just such an organic thing. There's just you know, there's roots that go deep, there's roots that go out that way. It's really the community itself that kind of makes that happen or not happen. And you know, sometimes the healthiest thing is that something goes away and makes room for something else. So I have no formula. I'm sorry if it's a disappointing thud to the end of the interview.
Is there anything else you want to kind of get on the record, so to speak, that we didn't have a chance to talk about?
I don't think so. I can't think of anything. I will in the middle of the night. At 2 o'clock tonight, I'll have a great idea.
All right, well, thank you so much, Joanne. for your
You're
time
welcome.
and for
Thank you.
Launching this project.
I didn't think I could do this for.
And you did. We're good.